Hey everybody, it's Stacey Simmons from Beyond the Woo. Welcome back to our episode on Would God Approve? We hope you're enjoying it. Welcome to part 2.
I think the other fascinating thing is that we can see now on, you know, functional MRI scans is when we look at someone who's in deep meditation or
Mm.
prayer,
Mhm.
or while they're taking a psychedelic medicine, their brain
That's
function
right.
looks very similar, which
Mhm.
is really fascinating to me.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's something that doesn't get talked about enough, that that faith and medicine, and psychedelic medicine specifically, and things like trance and even some kinds of music when people are in flow, the fMRIs all look very, very similar.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So it's really interesting. So again, is the provision of this plant or animal
Mhm.
medicine or fungi,
Mhm.
um, is it allowing us to access, what maybe our defenses are keeping us from accessing? That this is lowering something that is allowing us to connect with our innate ability to tap into an inner intelligence, be it God, be it some other belief system that you hold. But, if we believe that God is in all and a part of all, and this allows us to commune in that way, or tap into that inner healing.
That's a really interesting way of framing it, because when you were talking, the first thing I thought of was the default mode network, right? Like, so when we the there's a whole slew of research, especially from Robin Carhart Harris and his research team up at UCSF, that talks about the default mode network going offline when people are using psychedelics. And the default mode network is several pieces of the brain that all are create a network together when you have no task in front of you. So when you don't have a task, your brain starts to go into kind of a ruminating type state, that some researchers associate with the ego. So if you think about, okay, if your ego is the thing that's engaged when you are ruminating, or when you are kind of being directive, or not, I should say, not being directive, when you're like, when your brain doesn't have a place to go. And if what happens when you do psychedelics is the DMN goes offline. So your brain is actually allowed to disconnect from that ego state, disconnect from that rumination state. It does take the amygdala offline and a couple of other important, like, negative parts of, not negative parts of our brain, but harder, more difficult things to manage in our brain. But if you don't have a a thing in your psyche or in your brain that's telling you you're terrible, or telling you you're a bad person, or telling you that giving you all this constraint of how you can and can't be, then you naturally have an opening for love to come in, for opportunity to come in, for hope to come in, right? Like, and you have your brain making more connections in those ways. So yeah, when you were talking about that, it just really hit me like, oh wait, that's the DMN going offline. And you get that with prayer. We've seen
Hmm.
that with people who are experienced meditators. There's plenty of research about that. And same thing with people who are in flow and people who are doing psychedelics. So it's like, there's something here. There's something about, like, disconnecting from that default mode network that helps us feel more connected. Yeah, and in fact, whether you're a person of faith or not, if the DMN is offline and you find meaning, then you're having the same kind of experience as somebody who's a person of faith. So,
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and is the medicine maybe allowing us not to lean into our own current understanding, but to lean into a different understanding? And I think of like Proverbs 5:6 that talks about trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not into your own understanding. You know, again, I'm not a theologian, and obviously this is that verse is within context of other things, but I think it is a fascinating place to intersect. You know, because when psychedelics, we actually are, able to access a different type of understanding, and we're not leaning into our current understanding that's been distorted,
mm,
and overwhelmed by depression, anxiety, traumas. It allows us to lean into a new insight, and to trust that new material is being presented and that we can look at
mm.
things in a new way, that is opposite from maybe what our understanding was before.
So interesting because there's this idea, and we hadn't talked about this before, but now that I'm listening to you, like there's this idea in Judaism called lashon hara, which is the negative word, right? And sometimes it's associated with gossip, and and when you have that negativity in your brain, right? Like that that is not good counsel, right? So to have the negative word kind of be the critic, the imposter syndrome, like all of that, if that's showing up all the time, we as therapists, we're trying to always talk our clients out of it, or help them find ways to manage it, or help them find resources or interventions to kind of disrupt it. But when we start talking about psychedelics and like giving them a tool that kind of disrupts it organically for them with them, so that they can feel what it feels like. I mean, there is something divine in that, right? Like, because you're disrupting that negative word, that negative power that is part of us, right? It's definitely part of us. But how do how do you want to think about it? I mean, there's a controversial idea, right? Like, is psychedelics like help get the devil out of your brain for a minute, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's that saying? The devil in me,
Uh-huh.
kind of like, I'm terrible with sayings, but it's kind of like so often, we equate something to some evil entity,
Mm,
but
mhm,
it's our own negative beliefs or
mhm,
negative trappings
mhm.
it's our own devil that we've created, so
Yeah.
to be able to silence that for a moment and lean into a different, emotional, mental state that maybe can bring a little bit more clarity, a little bit more insight, and allow us
Mhm,
to drop our defenses that have built around a belief system that
mhm.
actually hasn't served us.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so tricky. It's
Mm,
really tricky, right? Like,
it
because
really, really is.
you really have to ask or call on that discernment, right? Like, help me out here, like, because
Hmm.
it's so easy. It would be so easy to get lost in it. Now I'm just thinking about conversations I've had with clients or even my family, like, people who might be going down the road where you're like, ooh, wait, right? Don't know about that, but you can't, you also, as therapists, we don't want to tell people what to believe, how to believe, but maybe ask them to use their discernment a little more
Hmm.
intentionally.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think discernment isn't something that we talk about a lot in our
Mhm.
modern day world.
Mhm.
you know
Yeah.
Sometimes we are like, we'll help people like sort out, like, is this feelings driving this, or is there facts behind this?
Mhm.
Are you are you talking to someone that's giving you good guidance?
Mhm.
But I don't know if we talk so much about discernment very often.
Yeah. Feels like something that is hard to it's hard to help someone develop
Mm-hmm.
if they don't like if they're not already prone to that kind of thinking,
Mm-hmm.
but I think it's critical, like, and it's beyond critical thinking because discernment can like tap into everything that's important to you, all the places where you've invested in your values or where you have meaning. Like discernment falls on all of those things, right? It's not just, well, this is a fact in a book, so it's this, right? Like it's more like, okay, but you have to feel your way into it and also use your brain and also look at facts and also talk to people you care about and whose counsel you trust. And it's a big ask, but you're really asking. I mean, I think in elevating discernment, what we're saying is like be a whole human, use all of it.
Oh, absolutely. Well, and in that discernment, who are you going to?
Mm,
Who are you seeking out to sit with? And again, I've kind of come back to this place of seeing this more as a medicine,
mhm,
not a spiritual tool,
mhm,
although many people have a spiritual experience. But I really see this, being used in an ethical way,
mhm,
as a medicine, and using discernment and seeing that as a medicine,
mhm.
and that I'm helping clients like really discern the material that's coming
Yeah,
up in that session. And I'm using this in a very ethical way and in more of a medical
yeah,
setting.
absolutely.
There isn't a lot of ritual in what I do.
Mhm,
I think there are practitioners that probably do have more ritual. I might start out with a little bit of breath work. I might start off with a little bit of a meditation, you
mhm,
know, but, in the office itself,
mhm.
I'm not lighting candles. I'm not using sage. I'm not
invoking in any prayer.
Yeah. I'm not asking any entities or beings to be present. I'm not looking towards the north, the south, the east, and the west. I'm sitting someone in a reclining chair and giving them a pillow
with a weighted blanket.
With a weighted blanket, and hooking them up to an IV. If we're working with ketamine, which is very medical, if I'm taking someone to the jungles of the Yucatan, there's a little bit more ceremony in that, just primarily because I'm working with an indigenous medicine provider, and she's going to bring a little bit of her traditional practices to that. So in that setting, there I'm not putting people in blindfolds, and I walk around barefoot, and I do have necklaces on, which normally I don't wear necklaces. I'm wearing a free-flowing outfit. So I mean, a lot of my clients say, like, we like this Jennie in Mexico.
Like Mexico Jennie.
Yeah. We like this Jennie in Mexico. This is fun. So there's a little bit different Jennie that's down there, but I'm not particularly bringing any. You're definitely not going to hear me chant. I mean, if I began chanting, everyone would just get up and get back on the airplane. Because they'd be like, no.
Are you saying you don't have a singing voice for medicine?
I do not have a singing voice, I am not musically inclined. Ishka does allow me to use, I've got a rattle. And she allows me to use the rattle. That's all I am allowed to use, So that would be about the only thing. Every so often she lets me spray a little rose water. But even that, apparently, sometimes I have a heavy hand and want to put a little more rose water than what is required. In those moments. So,
but to be fair, like even in those settings, right? Like you are not bringing a different religious experience to your clients. You are allowing whatever faith, whatever practice they are used to engaging in. That is their domain. It is not something. I mean, it's still therapeutic, even if you're going down to Mexico and like serving bufo or serving psilocybin. It's still their religious practice. It's not something, I mean, you're not bringing Jesus into it. You're not bringing, Ishka's practices, whatever they may be. Like, that's not what you're doing down there.
No, absolutely not. And I'm grounding that again and seeing this as a therapeutic treatment, and, we're interweaving in a 4-day retreat. I'm going to do some brain spotting, which is kind of adjacent to EMDR therapy, if people have heard of EMDR. I'm doing some attachment-based, emotionally focused therapies, kind of understanding how our anxious or avoidant attachments are showing up that are keeping us disconnected from others in our life or from our purpose or for making a greater meaning. I might use some other trauma modalities to help with the integration process, but the whole 4 days are really around this piece of like, again, what is the set? What is our intention for doing these medicines?
Right.
And for me, I see it as a medicine treatment that is to tap into our innate ability to heal and to alleviate mental and emotional suffering without using a pharmaceutical medicine, and to actually, really truly provide healing. The whole reason why I got into psychology was to, help people along the path of healing and mental wellness and emotional wholeness.
Yeah, I mean it's a hard thing because it's like I know you and I've talked about outside of the podcast, just in our practice when we're hanging out, catching up with each other. Like there are people who really misunderstand what number one, what we're doing, even with the ketamine in the office, which is legal and quite clinical in its like demonstrative application. And people who've had some criticism of you going down to Mexico, like that's been real.
Yeah, that's been really hard for me to navigate and has brought a lot of sadness. And again, has, at times, caused me to really pause and again, go seek out in my own faith. Is this appropriate that I'm doing this? Is this okay? To find out that clients are no longer seeing me because they believe that I'm walking in some evil practice, that, I'm not doing any chants, I'm not doing any rituals, I'm not asking for any spiritual entities to show up in this place. I'm not engaging in any paganism rituals or anything like that. I'm not casting any spells. I am not, doing any cleansing aura ceremonies. I'm not seeing auras. I'm not working with auras. I'm not working with energy. I am working with, I believe that God has given me a healing ability and
Mm.
that that's a gift that he did give me. And I'm sitting with that in a responsible way, and I'm showing up with the clients and being present with them in the path that they feel called, and providing discernment in the
Mhm.
material that they're coming up across and helping them integrate that in a responsible manner. I am not a shaman. Ishka, who's my
She's
medicine
not a
provider,
shaman, yeah.
she does not identify herself as a shaman either, which I think is really interesting. Because if you go here in the US to some of these underground facilities, you find a lot of these individuals that proclaim themselves to be shamans.
Mhm.
And so even Ishka, who is an indigenous medicine provider, has sat with many indigenous teachers. And even the Seri tribe, the main medicine woman there, does not believe that she is a shaman, that that is not a gift that's been bestowed upon her, that she is trained by her father, who has a lineage to a shaman. But they actually don't believe that they have been gifted and can use that term shaman.
Mhm.
They're a teacher, which is adjacent to maybe a shaman, but they don't believe they have any actual, kind of like
Shamanic gifts.
shamanic abilities.
Mhm.
Um, they just believe that they're to sit with people,
Mm.
and provide a pathway.
Kinda like a therapist.
Kind of like a therapist. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's our job, sit with
Hmm.
people.
Yeah.
I mean, it really, for me, raises, like, some other connections, thinking about it from the perspective of what is like, a person who's going to have a a person of faith is going to have an experience that might include their faith if they are having a psychedelic experience. If their psyche is longing to make sense of something, then that has a spiritual dimension, then they're going to likely see their spiritual meaning show up in their experience. And, just thinking about, talking about um the way that you interact with people, like the Good Friday experiments in Boston, like those experiments, the people who engaged that experiment at the time, I think it was Timothy Leary and one of his students,
Yeah. I think it was Walter
Ponky.
Punky.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he worked with Timothy Leary, and so Ponky, I think, was at Boston University, and Leary was at Harvard, and they decided to do these experiments with, I think it was LSD on, or it might have been psilocybin on, seminary students. So they exposed the seminary students to these substances on Good Friday, and they wanted to see, would they have a spiritual experience,
Hmm.
and most of them did.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and this study was way back in 1962,
Mhm.
and it was psilocybin. And how fascinating that they chose to do this on Good Friday,
Mhm.
and that they all they made sense of it. And maybe that's because how we make sense, our frame of reference of how we make sense.
Mhm.
But they all had a religious, spiritual experience
Mhm.
of meeting God. Um, and what was fascinating about that is that they did follow up,
Yeah, yeah.
on them. Gosh,
It's like 20 or
I
30
think it
years
was like
later, right?
20 or 30 years
Yeah.
later. And many of them really found that that was a profound moment in time for them and that it shaped their
Right.
pathway, and their continued work in theology and in their faith. And so it did help draw them closer to
Mhm.
God and their
Mhm.
religious beliefs,
Mhm.
and really had some, pretty positive, connection with deepening their faith in God.
Yeah. Well, even just thinking about, like, Timothy Leary's collaborator, I can't remember his original name, but he became Ram Dass. He was the collaborator with Leary on most of the experiments that they did at Harvard. They were both dismissed from Harvard, and then Ram Dass went off to India, and he became a spiritual teacher and mentor to a number of people, but that all began with his own experiences of psilocybin and LSD, and really having spiritual experiences of expansive nature to see, that the world was much more complex, and he wanted to be a part of it in a meaningful way. But I mean, to go back to the Good Friday experiments, it's, that really for me, it underlines that whatever language you speak in terms of your own spiritual beliefs, if you have a psychedelic experience that engages some spiritual aspect, it's going to come to you most likely in your own spiritual dimension. It's going to speak to you in the language you understand. It's not going to, if you're a Christian, you're not going to have an experience that's Buddhist for the most part. Like that's unlikely to take place, right? And if you're Buddhist, you're unlikely to have a Christian experience. Like it's just unlikely. You're going to
Mhm.
be engaged in a meaningful way in your own spiritual language. And I think that's really important to remind people. It's not saying that there's no spiritual, it's not saying that the spiritual dimension is weak or that it's not real. It's saying that the spiritual dimension is coming to people in the language they understand, in the ways that they connect. And the pathway is not as important as the destination in that regard, right? Like you're having this experience, and again, to go back to the psychological piece, like we are not interested in people's spiritual expression. We're interested in the healing that comes. And if the healing has a spiritual dimension, we want to know what it is. We want to be able to speak in that language to our clients, regardless of what the language is.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, and I think what was interesting about that Good Friday experiment is they
mhm.
actually divided the group into
Oh,
two
that's right. They
groups.
gave one group niacin,
They
right?
gave
Yeah.
one group niacin. So
Mm-hmm.
one group got a placebo.
Mm-hmm.
And niacin, if any of you have taken niacin, you get like this flushing
Mm-hmm.
experience where your
Right. Because
skin
you're
feels
hot.
flushed, you
Yeah.
feel hot. So because people had this experience, and these participants had never had psilocybin, so they didn't know what to experience,
Mm-hmm.
but they had a physical sensation. So they didn't know whether or not they had truly gotten psilocybin or
Mm-hmm.
they had gotten the placebo. They all had a physical sensation.
Mm-hmm.
And what was interesting in that study is that the individuals who did receive psilocybin scored higher on the
Yeah.
mystical scale, and also reported a deeper connection with God in that experience.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a difference in those individuals having the psilocybin versus not having that psilocybin.
Yeah.
So I think that that's important. And then also the set became a critical part of that as
Mm-hmm.
well. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that again really draws back to why it is so important to work with a practitioner that is well trained and
Mm-hmm.
understands, the mindset that we have going into this in a responsible way, and the setting. You
Mm-hmm.
know, what are the reasonings and the place that we're choosing to, have the setting, whether this is going to be in our office at Hope Therapy Center, in a more medical controlled setting, or if this is going to be with me out in the jungles of the Yucatan down in Cancun, Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
which choose Mexico, choose Mexico.
Yeah, hopefully it'll be legal. It'll be legal in other places soon. But yeah, I mean, the Mexico experience definitely one that's gives people more opportunity, gives them more exposure, I think, to
Mhm.
different kinds of experiences. So yeah, definitely. That's
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah. So, and then that's just a little note on the follow-up study was done in 1991. So
Mm,
that was actually almost 30 years later, which
yeah.
was really incredible. So Rick Doblin was who did the follow-up study, and he confirmed that psilocybin, in a religious context,
Context. Yeah.
did deepen someone's God-focused experience
Yeah.
in that, and that it really did open up this intersection of what we're trying to do today
Yeah.
of, would God approve,
Mm-hmm.
where does psychedelics intersect with our faith, and and how do we maybe destigmatize that, demystify
Mm-hmm.
it, and recognize that this isn't a pagan ritual, that
Nothing
this
wrong
could,
with pagan rituals, by the way,
well,
but
okay.
yeah.
For those who are the Judeo-Christian, paganism has a very negative connotation,
I
right?
understand.
And they
Mm-hmm.
they will say like, "Oh, that's a pagan ritual," and
Mm-hmm.
that's you're walking into darkness,
Mm-hmm.
which is what I had several clients who stopped working with me as a clinician. They're like,
Mm,
"You're a great therapist. This is the best therapy I've ever experienced, but I just can't do it because I think you're walking in darkness now."
mm.
Which was really sad.
Yeah,
You
I
know?
can imagine how hurtful
Yeah.
that must have been for you.
Yeah.
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 I mean, and to piggyback a little bit on Doblin, so he's, for those who don't know, so Rick Doblin is also the founder of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, also known as MAPS, which is responsible for all of the current effort in studying the effects of MDMA on trauma and PTSD specifically. So they had a big failure this year, which is very depressing for those of us in the psychedelic space. But I think they'll bounce back. But he's been at this for, I don't know, what, 40, 50 years. I mean, he's been at it for a long time, trying to make sure that we treat psychedelics with the respect that they deserve. So shout out to all the effort that he's made over the years, and including in the, kind of examination of the long-term effects of the Good Friday experiment. So we have, we have a few more minutes to finish up this episode. We have so much to still talk about. So I want to kind of jump into the ethical and moral challenges that we have thinking about moving forward with how we think about psychedelics from a therapeutic perspective, but also just, taking into account what faith might mean for people. It's like, it's interesting you're making the joke about paganism, but it's like, for people who do identify as pagans, like it's, I want to make the distinction that for those people who have a negative connotation about paganism, it's usually because they see pagans as godless. And for modern practicing pagans, they don't see themselves as godless. They see themselves as not Judeo-Christian. So just being a little bit nerdy about making the distinction. So,
Right, right.
yeah.
Well, and I think that, in that where I think, Judeo-Christian kind of goes is like, oh, well, then you're engaging in sorcery if you're in paganism, and I want to make clear that this work that I'm doing, I do not believe that I'm engaging in sorcery. I'm not brewing up any, while I may brew the ayahuasca, I may warm that up so it's not cold and too horribly bitter. I am not brewing up any potions
Right.
to give someone. So I do not believe that that is becoming like sorcery or pharmakia type of sorcery work that we're doing with these medicines, and I think that that's, again, the place where I kind of had to sort through, because in Galatians, it talks about, warning against drunkenness, and sorcery. And in First Peter it calls for sober mindedness, and so I really kind of, again, had to sort through, like, what is it that I'm doing with these medicines? Again, I'm not, I may be sitting with someone, but I'm not actually, brewing a potion to heal you. That is, allowing for healing to occur through taking these medicines. And I'm bearing witness to your experience and helping you make sense to your experience. And I'm staying sober minded,
Right.
which I think is important too, where, in some of these other settings, individuals will go and partake in medicine ceremonies. And the person who's serving medicine is also serving the medicine to themselves.
Right.
So they are not sober-minded, and they're not leading that person in a sober-minded way. I am not taking medicine when I'm sitting with someone, so I am sober-minded. So I am able to help someone, guide someone to make sense of their experience.
Yeah. It's not therapy then, it's a party.
Yeah, it's a party. So that would be recreational use.
Right, exactly. That's not what we do.
No.
But to go back to your point about the pharmakia, like the pharmakia, just for the audience in case they don't know, like that's the Greek word that's used in the Bible about sorcery and about brewing up potions. This is the word that's used in the original Greek, right? Is that right?
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. So, and the way I understand pharmakia is that it's, it may have been associated not so much with the brewing of potions or beer or anything like that, but it might have been related to things that were happening at the time. The Eleusinian mysteries had been disbanded in Greece around that time, and they used something called kykeon, which was we think it's either made from ergot, which is what LSD comes from, or it was made from psychedelic mushrooms. So that they were people doing these amazing, like, multi-day experiences that are more like, if I were going to have a modern equivalent, I'd say Burning Man would probably be the closest, right? Like people going and doing some LSD and doing Burning Man for a couple of weeks. Like that was the Eleusinian mysteries, right? And they had been disbanded around the same time that the Gospels were written down. So for me, I'm kind of, it's a leap, but it's also just kind of context, right? To say that the pharmakia aspect of saying, well, don't go off and just think that you're going to have an experience that's divinely inspired when really all you're doing is having a party,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So again, that comes back to the moral and ethical dilemma again of,
Mm-hmm.
how are we using these medicines? Are we
Mm-hmm.
using these in a responsible manner? Are we using these with trained professionals? Are we using this in a way that is a vehicle of healing rather than, escapism?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's where pharmakia or kind of more comes into. It was escapism,
Right.
and I know people love Burning Man and and I've thought about going and being a burner, but I don't know. I just don't think I can be out in the
I
desert
like
and
showers.
carry. I like showers and toilets too much, and so more power to those who love to go out and do Burning Man. But I think it's a very different experience.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, going out there and doing some medicine for a week-long period of time,
Mm-hmm.
you're not going in with maybe the intention and the setting that is specifically geared towards a medical practice of what
Mm-hmm.
we're doing. We're working towards mental and emotional healing, trauma recovery. We're using these substances to allow for a reset, able to access our innate ability to
Mm-hmm.
heal, and my belief is that God provided these medicines to allow for us to tap into our body's ability to actually heal, regenerate, turn on those synapses that have been turned off, create
Mm-hmm.
neurogenesis, allow for us to tap into a larger part of our brain. I mean, I think, if we go back to the piece of what my experience with psychedelics has been, I come out of it with very creative. I'm able to like put together connections on things that I wasn't making connections on before because I believe that it's lighting up those neural pathways. Look, we know as, science is showing us we use a very small part of our brain.
Mm-hmm.
So if this allows for us to expand and use more parts of our brain, connect, you know, parts of our brain in a more meaningful way to make new understandings,
Mm-hmm.
change and modify our behaviors, it's used with an appropriate, intention.
And discernment again. And I think to your point, like we're also finding that the way our brain works is not like the parts of our brain don't work in isolation. They work in networks most of the time. So we'll have one network will be active and then it'll switch to another network or to a subset of that network. And the more expansive capacity you have to allow those networks to integrate with each other more and be more flexible, the more healing is possible.
Mhm.
That's what we're finding more and more in the neuroscience. And so, if we're focused on how do we facilitate that for people so they have more access to more networks and more complexity in their brain rather than just running along the same tired circuit that they've been using since they were 12, then we're going to find that people have more capacity for healing. And I think that's the key to me that is really important as we do more and more research and work to expand our understanding and also our clients and our patients' understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, that grounds us back into
Mhm.
using discernment even in is this even right for me?
Mhm. Yeah,
Because there's many paths to healing. This may not be the right path for you.
yeah,
There's medical contraindications, which we'll
absolutely.
cover in future episodes. And there can be dangers with
Absolutely.
this as well. So it has to be done responsibly. You need discernment, and you need discernment in how you integrate it, and also, part of that is also going into this with intentionality, not going in expecting I'm going to have a mystical experience, not seeking a mystical experience, not seeking ego disillusion is
Mhm.
the thing that so often clients come in, they're like, "Oh, I want to have ego disillusion."
Mhm.
You know, again, I think this will take you on a pathway and you'll receive what you're meant to receive, and then it's your job really to
Yeah,
do the
do the
work
work. Yeah.
afterwards of what you've received. How do I integrate that? How do I make sense? And I received what I needed to receive. And,
Mhm.
I so often have clients who come out and they're like, I didn't meet God, or I didn't
Yeah.
meet this, or you know, if you go in with the wrong intention, it's going to be elusive to you.
Oh, that is such an important point. Like, and it's so interesting to think about it from the intention aspect, right? Like, if you're going into the experience wanting to have an experience that takes you out of your healing, right? Then you're in it for the wrong reasons. Then we're back to the party, right? Like then you're just escaping.
Mhm.
You're just there. If you don't want to feel something, you're doing psychedelics, it's the wrong reason to do psychedelics. If you are using psychedelics to feel something, to go deeper toward feeling, to go deeper towards understanding, then you're doing psychedelics for the right reasons. But if you're doing it as a way to avoid something, certainly don't come to us. We're not going to be the people to help you with that experience. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that that has brought us to just a perfect natural end to this
Hmm.
episode that will allow us to kind of deep in and dive deeper in on our next episode that
Hmm.
really is looking at this more deeply as that tool for healing,
Yeah.
and, getting away from the mysticism and seeking that mystical
Hmm.
experience or that ego dissolution experience. Um, so tune in for our next episode as
Yeah.
we continue to explore this controversial topic. Would God approve?
Yeah. So go beyond the woo with us. Leave us your questions and comments. We want to know all about it. We want to hear what your experiences have been and maybe how you have had to wrestle with your faith as you have gone on your own psychedelic experiences or you've explored psychedelic therapy. Let us know. Put some questions in the comments and we'll see you next time.